Welcome. Happy spring. It's sure great to be together again. I hope this morning's snow squall didn't prove too challenging for some of you driving in. It was a little interesting for me. It's also a potent reminder that it's not always easy to pry winter's cold fingers from our lives, but we're here. And the days are getting longer, and the natural world is awakening. Where I live, along the Penobscot River, where it's tidal, this is especially obvious from the spectacular flocks of mergansers that recently showed up almost like clockwork to feast on migrating smelt. Once the mergansers plunge underwater in search of those fish, it's only a matter of time before the herring gulls join in the feeding frenzy. And last Tuesday, and I wrote this down because I'd never seen it before, last Tuesday, I watched an immature eagle try to get in on the action. It is such a big fish, wingspan way bigger than mine, and trying to catch such a small fish, pretty memorable. But here's the thing. If you read the fishing regulations in Maine, you'll know, as I now do, that it's illegal to fish for smelt on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. So it's pretty obvious that these birds are thumbing their bills and their beaks at us. And it makes you wonder, where is the Marine Patrol when we really need them? Of course, this conference is also a wonderful sign of spring. It's exciting to see so many amazing sessions, talks, and posters. I think we've set a new record after more than 20 years of attendance, so way to go, everybody. I always look forward to our keynote address. Where so many compelling speakers. Judy East is here somewhere. Judy? You're here. Oh, there you are. Gave the keynote last year. Great job. And all of these speakers are really not just focusing on the many challenges we're facing, but also the important opportunities to work together to create a sustainable and just future. And this year is definitely no exception. I won't repeat the information in the short bio of our speaker. That alone should give you a good idea of the breadth and depth of experience that Linda Shai brings to this work. Instead, I'd like to share a few insights I've gained as a member of a NOAA planning grant that Linda is leading with colleagues from across New England. This project seeks to ensure that equity and justice are core priorities for all climate adaptation planning, including in the context of climate migration and the many other factors driving migration in our changing world. If you'd like to know more about that project, there's a couple talks, really interesting ones this afternoon in session M, and that's M for magnificent. The entire session is focused on resilience. As you'll soon see, Linda is unusually skilled at connecting the dots when it comes to the myriad factors and complex interactions that shape our world. And in my experience, planners are unusually adept at this kind of systems thinking. But even so, we'll never be able to predict with certainty what's coming next. I mean, Exhibit A, who knew just 4 years ago that two of the biggest challenges we'd be facing were the deadliest global pandemic in a century and the biggest armed conflict in Europe since World War II. So how do you prepare for things that are inherently unpredictable? I'm not sure. But this is exactly the kind of question that helps explain why Linda and so many others, especially at this conference, are trying to figure out how we can help communities strengthen their resilience. Linda's work to build resilience is informed by models and insights from a wide range of academic fields, as well as rigorous analyses of what we've gotten right and what we've gotten wrong in our past efforts to tackle complex societal problems. She draws important lessons from many different contexts, real world, both rural and urban, local and global. One place to see the power of her approach is in her 2021 paper in Science, a paper titled Transforming Climate Adaptation in the United States, which she wrote with Susie Moser, another brilliant researcher. Linda, you'll hear it today, but you can go read that paper too, and you'll see that she's thought long and hard about the roles that professions of design, engineering, and law need to play in amending building codes to reduce climate risk. The need for the insurance industry to place a greater emphasis on equity and justice in managing risks. And she's equally focused on one of the greatest challenges of our time, the need to deepen our collective commitment to democratic engagement and democratic practices. We're going to need a lot more leaders like Linda Shy. And this is another place where there's some good news. She's an extraordinary role model who is also doing an outstanding job of training and inspiring the next generation of leaders, problem solvers, and engaged citizens. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Linda Shy to the main sustainability.
Thank you so much, David, for those kind words. One of my favorite movies is Waking Ned Devine, and for those who don't know the movie, somebody has had a heart attack eating his chicken dinner while he learns that he's won the lottery. And through a very complex set of events, they end up holding a fake funeral for a different person. And this person says, you know, what a shame we only have funerals, and then you're never around to hear the incredible things people will say about you because you're dead. So instead, he goes on to eulogize his living friend who's in the audience. And I feel like now I can die a happy person, having heard the incredible things that David had said about me. So congratulations to David and all the organizers for organizing the Maine Water and Sustainability Conference. You know, sometimes people talk about how depressing the environmental and climate world is. And just to see so many of you gathered here talking about these issues, this to me is a remarkable sign of spring and of hope. So as David said, I work at the intersections of looking at institutions as well as looking at community and social movements and thinking about how do we create the kinds of radical new ideas we want, but also put them into the institutions that code and structure our world. So the work that we have done has traversed anything from looking at major development projects to looking at municipal finance, thinking about nature-based solutions, thinking about property taxes, regionalism. And so rather than going through any of these particular individual projects, I'd like to share with you all today just a few observations. And just listening to some of the sessions that I attended this morning, I'm really struck by how brilliant and wise you all are, how much real-world lived experience you bring into this space. And so I don't know that I'm actually saying anything that you don't know, but I hope that my remarks can help reinforce and elevate the work that you are already doing and perhaps make some connections across the things that I've been hearing. So, as we take on the specific challenges that bring you here today, it may not be climate change, but climate change will certainly impact all of the things that you do. Thanks to the Maine Climate Council and the Governor's Office for Policy Innovation and the Future, we have a good sense of the climate impacts that are going to be impacting this region. So citing some very worrying statistics from their 2020 report on climate impacts, it says that sea level rise and storm surge by 2050 could lead to the loss of about 22,000 jobs by 2050 and $17 billion in damages to buildings between 2020 and 2050. Sea level rise could also cost Maine about $1.5 billion in lost tourism due to the narrowing of the beaches, with 13 fewer million visitors due to that effect. Although Maine being warmer could maybe offset some of those things. Nearly $600 million of lost annual revenue from lobster and aquaculture because of rising, warming ocean waters, and that sea level rise could also contribute to a net loss of over 10 square kilometers of eelgrass and nearly 40 square kilometers of salt marsh that provide critical habitat to many species that live in Maine besides humans. These impacts in turn will have many different cascading impacts beyond their direct effects on Maine's social, economic, and governance systems. The loss of housing and property tax will have lots of impacts on municipal revenues. That'll hurt the fiscal health of local governments, which could in turn create greater burdens on social safety nets for elder care and unemployment. And I hope gender norms are changing, but for the moment it is still women who are engaged in the bulk of care in our societies. And so these impacts are going to be not only deeply personal, but also intersectional and compounded for many here. At the same time, this region, for others, will be comparatively more habitable, sometimes maybe even more habitable than it is now, compared to the climate impacts of much of the rest of the country and the rest of the world. There is a greater abundance of rainfall here, more fresh water, temperatures will be warmer, but not scorching. So maybe there aren't so many air conditioners here, but by 2100, the weather will be more like the present day mid-Atlantic with 5 days over 100 degrees per year. But at that same time, much of the rest of the country will have over 50 days above 100 degrees per year. And while there will be worse storms to come, it will not be as devastating or as frequent as hurricanes experienced elsewhere. And so for these reasons, many people are looking to places like Maine as a climate haven, a climate refuge, a place where many people will increasingly choose to migrate to. So at the same time that this area is experiencing a lot of climate impacts to deal with on its own, it will also have to contend with additional stressors of more people coming in and who will be certainly likely to be very different from the people who currently live here. There is also a growing understanding that we don't just want to have the climate transition and spend all of the billions of dollars that we have and to go through all of the pain that this change will have and then end up in the same exact position that we are today. We want to bounce forward rather than bounce back. So what does equitable adaptation mean in this context? Adaptation to what? Equity for whom? And what kind of a mindset and what processes are likely to get there? So today I want to share 4 observations drawn from the past decade or so of the work that I've spent looking at some of these issues. First, research across vastly different political, social, and economic contexts find that there is a very similar pattern. In societies that are highly unequal, adaptation efforts tend to reinforce or even exacerbate inequality. Many of you here are working on trying to promote sustainability and promote climate change from very progressive mindsets. But that has nothing to do with whether or not the efforts we are doing are actually going to be socially equitable. I often give my students, 3 of whom are here today, Andrew Epps, Lauren Ortel, and Rachel Renders, I often tell my students the analogy that if you have a sausage maker that's making sausage, even if you put in a different kind of meat, you're still going to make sausage, right? And so that is to say, unless we take a very conscious effort to change what we're doing to be more equitable, then we are by default going to create more inequity. Our understanding of fairness, right? This is fundamentally about fairness. Our understanding of fairness is never just about what happens to us. It is always relational. It is about what happens to us in relation to the past and to others. So I have 2 young kids, 6 and 8, Zoe and Cooper. They're very excited that I mentioned them in front of all of you. And it doesn't matter how many hugs I give them, does not matter how much candy I give them, does not matter how many hours of screen time they get. If their sibling gets more, it is complete Armageddon in our house. So similarly, it is not enough to consider whether an adaptation is fair or unfair for a particular group on their own, except in relation to the history of what that community has experienced in the past and what that community is experiencing relative to others in that society. So let's take, for instance, the situation of recovering from a flood. Some people, people who have houses, and disproportionately in this country that tends to be white people, have far more assets, and they are better positioned to be able to have the resources to recover after a flood to rebuild their homes, to wait it out in a hotel, to have a second place that they could live. They are also disproportionately likely to receive buyout funding. This is federal funding that will buy your house at pre-disaster market rate values, and you give it to the government will demolish it, and then you move somewhere else. So then they are disproportionately also more likely to receive funding not for a buyout, but for a seawall or for drainage improvements and infrastructure. And so that means that people who have a lot more assets to start with have much more access to both private resources as well as public resources to either adapt in place or to move when they so choose. And by contrast, people who have far fewer assets, which includes all the racialized minorities as well as all the renters, they are far less likely to have a lot of individual private assets as well as access to public resources to adapt. Let's take another example of the IRA, right? Unlike floodplain management, this is actually really focused on promoting justice. It has dedicated $50 billion to environmental resilience, disasters, and other water-related needs. Under President Biden's Justice 40 initiative, the federal government has made it a goal that 40% of the overall benefits of these investments should flow to disadvantaged groups that have historically borne the greatest burden of pollution and other kinds of environmental harm. And this is a really, really important strategy to actually put our money where our mouths are, and this kind of redistribution will make a meaningful impact in these communities. But when this funding is spent in spatially unequal places, in spatially unequal housing markets, with our current existing land and property systems, it's not really at all clear whether the people who are currently benefiting from such infrastructure investments will actually be able to hold on to their homes over a long time. So a lot of people I see are nodding, and so you're familiar with the concept of green or climate gentrification, because these kinds of investments, not even without the investments, currently property values are already disproportionately faster rising in higher elevated areas and lower flood-prone areas. But certainly the addition of new green amenities, such as nature-based solutions and other forms of protective infrastructure, are going to make their homes much more attractive to others. And so the problem here isn't whether or not we should invest in frontline communities. We should do so. We should scale up our investments. We should grow our funding for nature-based solutions, for adaptive infrastructure, for all of these things. But the problem is about the models of governance that we have, the models of taxation, the models of land ownership. So, in other words, it is not enough to pay attention to redistribution of our resources. It is also important to think about the underlying institutions that shape those inequalities in the first place. And that brings me to my second point. Our institutions are coded for decentralizing responsibility to individual people and municipalities. And that makes cooperation and collective action really difficult, as I'm sure many of you are discovering. So at a national level, our architecture for land use says the following. We, the federal government, will fund, I don't know why I said we, I'm not the federal government, okay. I recently went into a community meeting in Ithaca and she said, you're with the program. You're against the people. I was like, I'm from Cornell. They don't like us much better than the federal government either. So the federal government will fund as much large protective infrastructure, levees, dams, dikes, as they can afford, so that people can live in places that indigenous people and other early settlers have long known are not necessarily the places that are safe to live in. Within the local arena, we will draw boundaries into as many municipalities as people would like to ensure their personal individual freedoms to live in the kinds of communities they would like to live in. And if something goes wrong, hopefully there is some disaster assistance and the federal government will kind of help us restart this process all over again. So in effect, we have drawn a lot of boundaries at the level of individual property, at the level of municipalities, so that we can protect what is ours and exclude others. And this exclusion ability is philosophically, morally, and operationally the basis of what allows for inequality. So I'll share an example from some of the work that we've done. We've done, you know, I hear again and again from people from conferences, you know, everyone says, we can't do that because of property taxes. But nobody really studies property taxes. So we had mapped the impact of sea level rise on municipal local revenues for the state of Massachusetts and the state of Florida. And this data shows that for a subset of coastal municipalities, the impacts are really extreme. In coastal Massachusetts, that's about 25 to 50% of some local governments' total revenues are sitting within 6 feet of sea level rise. In Florida, there are over 30 municipalities for whom over 50% of their total local revenues relies on properties that currently are in the 6 feet of sea level rise. Some of them are actually over 99%. So there is enough land in a metro region to accommodate everyone. This is a very large country, and even in metropolitan areas, there's a lot of land. But each city is really bound in the end by its own borders, and they are constrained to try to cope with their impacts on their own. That is the model that we currently have. And so you have a lot of variation across the coast, where some municipalities that are coastal have very little impact by virtue of where they are and where their property taxes are like, and others that are extremely affected. And for some of them, it's like, so sorry, right? It's too bad, but it's your problem. It's not my problem. And if some of your people end up moving to my town, that could actually be good for me, right? That is the kind of thinking that we hear in the subtext. So now, in the face of these constraints, we're trying to get individual people to do the right thing. Please don't rebuild your house. Please move away. Don't live in the floodplain. We're trying to tell municipalities, please don't build in the floodplain. Please try to adapt your housing, even though that is going to be very expensive. And we're trying to ask people for either individual or municipal sacrifice and expenses, even though this is neither enabled in our policies or necessarily incentivized as a cultural practice. Regional organizations, of course, play a huge role in helping us to equalize across these different boundaries, and they can provide a lot of that broader, distributive, holistic thinking. So many metropolitan regions in this country have developed climate collaborations, climate collaboratives, for advancing both climate mitigation and adaptation goals. I studied them for my dissertation because I thought they were just the coolest thing and that they were the hope of our future. And what I found was that many of them are very effective in helping deliver shared vulnerability assessments, shared climate projections, shared trainings, and collectively advocating for more resources from federal, state, and foundation resources. They are often less effective or willing, at least so far, in actually getting regions to behave like an integrative whole. So it is ironic in some ways that they are advocating for more resources to support each individual municipality within a region to do their own adaptation efforts as they see appropriate and fit. So if we want to change the decisions that people are making and the towns are making, we can't just say, you're politically, ideologically not aligned with us. I challenge any politically progressive mayor who's facing these conditions to make a right choice. We have to actually change the policy envelope that they are trying to make those choices in. So let me provide two examples that I think are moving in the right direction. They are both from New Hampshire. It is not because I think New Hampshire is a cooler state than Maine. It just so happens that I know these two examples and they're both from New Hampshire. So one of them is Rock USA, which is a nonprofit social venture organization. And it basically helps the residents of mobile home parks buy the land that sits under their park collectively and to run them as a whole. You may or may not know this, but mobile homes are actually the largest source of affordable housing in this country. They exceed the number of total public housing and publicly subsidized housing as across the board, and yet nobody really focuses on them. In fact, planners regularly ban them from their municipalities or say they are transportation land use, they have to be screened, they have to be located in very undesirable parts of town, distant from various social resources. So residents of mobile home parks, tend to be more vulnerable for a variety of reasons. One, by nature of the structure of their land ownership model, they're sitting on land that is owned by a park owner, but they themselves own the unit, the mobile home part. And the mobile home is actually only mobile when you first move it onto the site. It is not really mobile once it is located there. And if that park owner then says, let's raise the rents, you really can't do anything because you can't move. Let's sell the park. I'm going to develop it and reap a windfall. You can't move your house. You can't take it somewhere else and sell it to somebody else. And so the room for exploitation is very, very high. And now there are a lot of big asset management corporations who are going around buying mobile home parks. At the same time, many of them have long been disinvested in by their landlords, so the infrastructure is out of date. Some of the older ones were not built to contemporary standards. And because of planning discrimination, they have been sited in places that are more vulnerable, and the populations tend to be older and have greater proportion of disabilities. So in this case, ROC USA helps the homeowners to buy the land. They assemble this funding from various sources, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, foundations, and so it's like a 1% interest rate loan. They buy this land. Built into the cost of the loan is technical assistance, so that they have 10 years of technical assistance on how to run a collectively owned park facility, and they make sure to put in investments for infrastructure upgrades. And the residents, when they own that property together, they know, as the executive director Paul Bradley says, they know where the skeletons are buried. And they want to make sure that those deficits of infrastructure are fixed so that they and their children can live somewhere that is safe. And so we're seeing that ROC communities are investing in stormwater infrastructure, drainage, community emergency centers, and all of those kinds of things. And their ability to do that is possible because in 22 states, there is legislation that gives park owners the right of first refusal to buy the park when it is going up for sale, and it secures their rights. A second example is in 2019, the New Hampshire State Legislature passed Senate Bill 285, establishing a coastal resilience and economic development program. And this bill is very interesting for two things. One, it says that communities may, due to a climate emergency, merge their municipalities. Right? They can change the borders, adjust them, or unify with one or more municipalities. Or, in a second strategy, achieves the same thing through a different route. It says that they can establish a joint municipal development and revitalization district, meaning that they can take land from several municipalities, share and allocate tax revenues and expenditures, and pool them together. Right? So, in effect, both of these pieces of legislation are state policies that are enabling private and local governments to cooperate as an institutionally protected and encouraged mechanism. And this brings me to my third point, which is that people who have been experiencing the short end of inequality, who have been left out of growth and capitalism and economic development, industrialization, they are often the best positioned to know how to right those inequalities. They have had to find ways to survive in the face of oppression. They know something about resilience and the core nuggets of what it means to survive. So there's often a sense of urgency attached to climate change. We have to do something by 2040. It's an imperative. We have a lot of urgency. And that is for very good reason. But the sense of urgency is also only new for some people. So if we're worried now about the loss of lobsters and tourism jobs, there are some rural communities that have been hemorrhaging people and jobs for many decades across the state. We're not worried about housing affordability because of climate migration, but there have been a lot of people here who have been competing with second homeowners and Airbnbs for a long time. We're worried about the loss of our sand dunes, our eelgrass, our marshes, and the ecological benefits that they provide. Indigenous people lost access to those resources 500 years ago. So as we, as the environmental movement, want many people to now care about climate, I also have to ask myself and all of us here, where have we been for the labor movement, the housing movement, the indigenous rights movements? And what care have we shown people who have been battling urgent crises in other domains. As I reflect on this, I'm really struck by the wisdom of indigenous communities that have stewarded this land for tens of thousands of years. Indigenous scholar Kyle Powys-White, an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, writes that indigenous relations are governed by 5 principles: kinship, accountability, respect, consent, and reciprocity. And so basically at the end of everything that I've said, it's really encapsulated in these 5 principles. If we take up kinship, how do we begin to understand all of us as being in relation to other? Second homeowners, vacationers from away, and local people. Urban people and rural people. Long-timers and the Somali refugees who are here. The people who are here with the lobsters and the eelgrass. If we treated all of our relations to each other as actually being sacred and important, what would that mean for how we deal with each other? Respect. Respect for each other's lived experiences and the actual housing, livelihoods, and health needs that they have instead of only economic value and property taxes. Consent, the importance of listening and trust building. Accountability, our accountability to each other, to the history of our times, to the harms that we've caused, and reciprocity across race, across class, across municipal boundaries. And recognizing the wisdom of people who have been left out and left behind, recognizing their knowledge that is born of struggle, of survival, and mutual aid, it is also a form of justice, of epistemic justice. So, for example, we are now advocating a lot for nature-based solutions. Indigenous groups here and others who have lived closely on the land, they are the real experts of nature-based solutions. Clam gardens to promote food security and shoreline stabilization have been used by indigenous groups here for thousands of years. This is not a new concept that is being invented by landscape architects. Or on the other hand, we're really wringing our hands about how to deal with the really stuckness of that property and that house that's on the shore when the ocean shorelines are moving. Indigenous groups have been mobile across this land, living in conjunction with the changes of the seasons and with the environments in this area for many years. And yet their very mobility and not putting down permanent residences on this land was the very reason that was used to say you are not actually using fully and maximizing the use of this land, and it justified their dispossession of that space. And so if we think about equity and justice, it also means changing whose knowledge counts, who gets the lead, and who gets credit for the kinds of new ideas that are being put forward. And indigeneity, as my colleague at Cornell, Professor Karim Ali Kassam says, is not just about tribal peoples living in rural areas. It is about any person who is native and living closely off the land. It can be farmers and hunters and fishers and people who are just very devoted and have a long history and awareness of this place. So, if we want to do more than just redistribute resources, if we want to actually remedy the causes of harm, we have to engage in policy reform, policy experimentation, and risk-taking. And that brings me to my 4th and final point, which is that experimentation and risk-taking require trust. Today, I think it was Tanya Rokowski who said in her session, you can only move at the pace of trust. So usually we point to the lack of funding, or maybe we point to the lack of political support as why we cannot do anything. But perhaps the greatest limitation is the lack of trust. Trust in good intentions, trust in the fact that you have actually goodwill towards me, trust that I will have the voice to voice my concerns, to adjust course, trust in knowing that I will be cared for and that there's a social safety net for me. The fact that there is an absence of trust indicates that there is a social rupture. Some harm has been done in the past to cause us not to be in trust with each other. And if we want to move forward towards bold, new strategies, then we have to think about what kinds of actions and choices have contributed to that. We want to create mechanisms of care, and that requires an investment in people. This morning, one of the sessions celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, which is a remarkable piece of bipartisan legislation that probably would not be possible today. But it's also interesting to observe that this act really regulates the pollution that you can dump into a waterway, but it's not the positive, affirmative responsibility to care for our waterways and watersheds. Care takes people and an investment of people and their labor. And it's curious to think about where in the IRA does it say to fund the capacity of people who are going to undertake the labor of building community, building trust, and overcoming the challenges so that we can then implement the technical strategies that many people have actually studied. So in summary, I hope I've made clear that climate change is not just something that we can address and tackle on its surface. The call rather is for us to work to redress the underlying drivers of climate change and societal vulnerability. That means not only spending money to shore up our infrastructure, but also fundamentally questioning how we develop, where, whose protection and well-being counts, and what our responsibilities are towards each other. When we discuss climate change, climate projections often cause us to imagine all sorts of climate apocalypse, ecosystem collapse, global migration. But how can our taxation systems, property rights, municipal boundaries, decision-making processes, and democracies not evolve under those kinds of conditions? And so how is it possible that we have devoted so much time and effort to modeling the impacts of climate change, but not necessarily modeling or debating the possible social and governance changes that will actually be required to respond under these climate impacts? So if we expect that we actually will have to change, if 100 years from now our governance systems do not look like what they look like today, then what kind of system do we actually want in place? And what I've argued here is that in imagining that, we don't necessarily have to reach for new ideas and invent them out of a hat. Actually, we need to center the people who have been left out and left behind of these processes and put their needs and knowledge at the center and the core of the things that we do. We have to elevate those ideas that already exist. I've argued that we need to give people space to talk about the areas where they feel that they have been marginalized or hurt or mistrust each other as a first step of building processes that then will address our existing needs. I've argued that centering the kinds of needs we have for affordable housing, for ecological and human health, then become the basis of creating systems of care and adaptiveness to climate variation and demographic change. And for all of these things, and all of these steps are really necessary for us to ultimately challenge some of the assumptions we have about how to govern and steward this land. So with that, let me close with an invitation for all of you to, and how to spend the rest of your day, to be really listening critically and intently to each other, both for the things that are said and the things that are not said, the people who are here and the people who are not here. So I'm going to poke gently at David, who has just been such a lovely colleague, and all of the conference organizers. I would ask about the name of this conference, Water and Sustainability. How can you have land? How can you talk about water without talking about land? How can you talk about sustainability without talking about people? And so how can we think about the future years of this conference and where it is going to grow and how you can grow the collective network of people who come into this space so that you can be more effective. And I call on you to think about how to be bridges of trust, of discipline, and of geography. Think about who it is that currently you don't trust very much, whether in this room or elsewhere. And among those people who you don't trust very much, how many of them do you need to work with you in order to achieve something that you want to do? And that is the blinking red light that we have to pay attention to, because we know we cannot act without them, and that source of disagreement is going to be key to how we can actually move forward. So thank you very much, and I look forward to taking some questions with you.
So there's lots of time for questions, and we have two friends with microphones, so if you raise your hand and the microphone folks head your way, we'll make this work, and you can call on it.
Okay, Gentleman in
But
plaid.
wait for a mic.
Oh, please wait for a mic.
This is a simple question. How do we get our hands on a transcript of your talk? That was brilliant.
That is the loveliest question to start with ever. Fortunately, I actually wrote it out, so I'm happy to share it with David, who can share it with anyone else. Thank you. Yes.
I'm probably going from lovely to tough, but I think there also has to be new solutions too. And a carbon tax would be a new solution. The tax code is the thicket that could sort out some type of a correction, if you follow me. But are you saying that things like a carbon tax aren't on the table, or? Sorry, I think I said a lot there, but you know.
So just to make sure everyone heard the question, it was, we also need new solutions like a carbon tax, and are those supposed to be off the table? I don't think that anything is necessarily off the table. The devil is in the details of how you design and think about them. But I will comment a few things, as we think about a carbon tax. A carbon tax is in some ways like the Clean Water Act, a right to pollute. Right, and so when in California they were passing I'm forgetting the carbon cap and trade program there, that effectively created such a system or something similar to it, there was a lot of opposition from communities that had long been living in the shadows of coal-fired power plants and other kinds of polluting facilities, because they were saying, you're saying if you just pay some money, you can keep doing what you're doing. And they were really in opposition to it, even though the funding then, the regulation was that more of that money has to be spent in environmental justice communities and would eventually come around to benefiting them. That was a concession after having passed a program that others had opposed. I was recently at another workshop talking about trans-systemic legal systems, of comparing civil, common, and indigenous law codes. That was a very fascinating conversation by a professor from Australia, because New Zealand had passed this new, through a treaty, really about a treaty claim over land for the indigenous peoples there. They are touted as having become the first river that was given legal protection status. And so another tribal member in Australia asked, is this what we should be doing? Should we be giving nature rights? Is this the approach that we want to take? And at the end of some of that discussion, they decided that even though it allowed you an outcome to address certain things, a legal rights-based system was not actually like what indigenous relations are about, because it claims that an individual exists in the form of that river and that they have certain rights. But it is different than saying the obligations and the reciprocity and relations that are tying people to that river and to other places. So I think that as we think about how do you structure things that financialize environmental assets, that we should be thinking carefully about who controls that and how it's going to affect different people, and that they should have a voice in the design of those systems. And perhaps there are ways to design it in ways that are just and sustainable, but that actually has to be part of the conversation. I think I saw a hand over here.
Way back.
Way back. Against the wall? Yeah.
Thank you so much for your powerful talk. So going back to the need to build trust and that invitation to think about who are you not trusting right now, and who do you need to work with within that? And within all of this, there's this theme of need to respect the land, the water, and each other. And I think that there's these deep histories, of course, of a lack of respect or lack of kindness between people. And we see how sense of urgency in this work can sometimes cause us to kind of set aside respect and trust building and kindness. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how to build trust where there's both those deep histories of lack of respect and kindness, and in places where we have to solve this now, and I know how to do it, is causing folks to act in disrespectful or unkind ways?
That is a terrific question. I don't think I have an answer really to solve that. Time and urgency is tricky because on the one hand, the climate and the carbon and the clocks are ticking. And on the other hand, sometimes when I walk through a space, I imagine like, wow, what if somebody 500 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago may have been walking in the same spot under these same stars, and things have changed so much, and yet we are still here. And so I think that there's a need to work at multiple different time scales, and that, you know, by default, you will not be working in those close conversations, even if you want to, on all of the different places. And so there will be multiple tracks of actions that are happening at the same time. But I think about what happened with the 1965 Fair Housing Act. That was in response to the civil rights movement, a recognition that a lot of housing things were illegal, and so it made it so that it is illegal to discriminate on the basis of race, for instance. But law does not alone change how people feel. And so what do communities do? They went towards economic zoning. So now you have large lots and certain setback requirements, and by virtue of that, you say who can live in your community. So we find new ways to get around it. And so we have now 300 years on, right, like 400 or 500 years, we are still engaged in this debate about like race relations. We still are grappling with this because we have not actually had some of those conversations, and it continues to obstruct fundamentally the ability of this country to move forward, right? So sooner or later, in one way or another, not addressing those deep-rooted harms and mistrust will come back to affect us. And at least in some places where that opportunity presents itself, I think it's important to actually to start with that. Lady in the blue sweater.
Thank you. Back to the carbon tax. The one you mentioned in California certainly is unappetizing, buying carbon credits. But the Citizens Climate Lobby for years now has been putting forward the idea of a carbon fee. As the fossil fuels come out of the ground, prices put on them, and then it's collected by the government and returned to citizens. It's called a carbon fee and dividend. And actually, most of Canada has done this now, and there are carbon fees in much of Europe. British Columbia did it in 2008 and proved that the amount of CO2 going in the atmosphere has come down there. Actually, it really helps equity, because if we did it in Maine, the people in Maine, 80% of Mainers would be better off financially from the dividend they receive than the slight increase in the price of oil and gas that comes from the fee. Because obviously, the big fossil fuel businesses are going to raise prices a little bit. But then it's returned to the people by the government in a dividend. And so in terms of equity, it works very well, this sort of carbon fee and dividend. So I'd like you to give that some thought in the future, because the majority of economists in America think it would be the most effective first step towards slowing down climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that concept. I will say that mostly my research focuses on climate adaptation, and so I am not a specialist in the carbon pricing area, and so I will defer any comments on that, but thank you for the idea to look more into it. Others? I think gentleman in red plaid over here.
Thank you. Great talk. So one of the things that you spoke to was the idea of community development and I guess sort of the municipalities merging. The United States, I'd say, is a country that has had a strong individualistic paradigm as compared to other countries. What are your thoughts or sentiments regarding sort of bringing those two ideas together?
Yeah. I feel like, I don't know, it's like people are asking these very deep and important questions. I don't know the specific answer to that. You're right, that this is a country that is really different from many other parts of the world that have long traditions of more collective action and community spirit, shall we say. But things also change over time, and the level of individualism is also created, and it ebbs and it wanes over history. And so I think when we take a historical lens, it's also possible to see at what times have motivations towards greater collective action taken place, and what kinds of things motivated that. So for instance, in the early colonial period, or the independence period, municipalities would grow and people wanted to be annexed by the central city because the central city had more money, more resources, better infrastructure, and so cities wanted to grow and be part of them. And that wasn't until Brookline became the first one in Boston to say, no, thank you, we want to keep our money up to ourselves, that really changed the trend, right? But when you go out west, the size of the cities is different than the ones that are out east. In different periods in this country's history, we've had city-county mergers, and that sometimes is now growing a very, very little bit, but some people are talking about this kind of a concept. And that usually, when you talk about mergers, are really times of crisis, and usually it's motivated by a fiscal crisis of drainage or sewers or school fees that local governments cannot pay anymore. And so when there is a sufficient crisis, people tend to be pragmatic about what is a structure that is going to work for them. And so I think the real question for me is also like, how bad does it have to be for us to be willing to entertain some of these larger changes? And when we get to a crisis point, is crisis actually going to motivate a more progressive approach or a more regressive approach? Because oftentimes it goes the other way. So I don't know, I think that it is also what you want it to be locally. Seems like Maine, has a particular kind of spirit. The reason I like the Rock USA example is that mobile home park communities are not exactly bastions of liberal democratic votes, right? But you have a community that you would say on its face is more politically conservative, and they are taking part in cooperative land ownership. There are more people living in rocks now than there are in all community land trusts in this country. And community land trusts are the darling of the liberal Democrats in cities where there are very dense and diverse populations. And so you have two very different populations embracing quite similar approaches because they see the importance and value that actually brings them.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk and your powerful words. I really appreciate it. One of the few of many quotes that I wrote down frantically is this idea of pushing the kind of political envelope or disrupting kind of whose knowledge is included in these decision-making spaces and considerations. And so to me, that's really a question of disrupting systems of power, largely. And in my mind, I'm wondering, what is the role you see universities or education broadly kind of taking place in that disruption, most especially given, as you said, you were from Cornell rather than the federal government when you were engaging with those folks, and I have very similar conversations. So thank you.
You should ask my students. Are we doing a good job? I don't know. I think they're spend a lot of time in sort of existential crisis. So we may or may not be doing a good job. I think that universities have such a privileged position in this space because we have the freedom of not being fired or voted in or out of power. And so I think that this is a space where We can say for communities, for instance, or local governments that don't have that kind of luxury and privilege, that we can be the places that actually do that thinking. There's a kind of a similar critique of foundations, like why should anybody have that much money, and why should foundations exist? There's a lot of pushback against foundations, that the dead hand of, the hand of the dead man, is actually like the mort man, is the one that's holding all of us. Like the Cleveland Foundation, I grew up in Cleveland, the Cleveland Foundation has more money in its annual giving than the disposable monies of the city of Cleveland, right? And they are beholden to only their board of trustees rather than the entire set. And so one author that I was reading, I think he's a professor at Stanford, said the only reason that we would want foundations to have this kind of power and money is because of their potential power to do exactly what you just said, to test those ideas that nobody else in public, private, government, societal sectors is willing to undertake, and to experiment with them and to push us further. And so I think that universities have that same kind of obligation, and that universities, in a way, at the same time, face the same kind of silos that municipal and other governments face. We are really siloed in our departments and our disciplines, and it's very hard to break some of those disciplinary boundaries. Just even try teaching a class with somebody from another department, and you will find every possible bureaucratic barrier preventing you from doing that. But if we don't make it easier, like they've made it easier to have centers that are cross-cutting, but teaching is really difficult. So I think that we also need to make those kinds of, to do the same thing within academia as I'm asking people to do outside of academia, so that we can actually teach across those kinds of boundaries.
Right there.
Great.
So this conversation could continue for much longer, and I hope you'll track Linda down as the day goes on and continue it. But for now, right before we start to move towards lunch, I want to build off Linda's comments. For me, they meant a lot, thinking about where we are and who's been here before us. I live on the Tidal Penobscot, as you already know, and so I think a lot about the canoes that have gone by for thousands of years on the way to the coast or back up the river. Another important reminder of this is the indigenous shell heaps that exist along our coast. We have a wonderful indigenous archaeologist in Bonnie Newsom. I don't think she's here today, but she, by the way, just got tenure yesterday, so she'll be at this for a long, long time. But Bonnie would be the first to tell you about the amazing stories that exist in these shell heaps. And so to remind you of that, and maybe have you come back to see Bonnie doing her work with great students up and down our coast, I'm going to present to you a scallop shell from Edgecombe Potters as a way to thank Linda for an amazing talk.